The heart monitor flatlined just as the biker's shadow crossed the glass wall of the neonatal ICU, and no one in the room noticed him yet. Only the sound, that long, merciless tone that told every trained mind present the same brutal truth. This baby was gone, or about to be. Before we go any further, if you believe stories about unexpected humanity, second chances, and the people we underestimate the most, go ahead and like and subscribe right now. You're going to want to hear how this unfolds. 15 surgeons stood frozen around the incubator, their gloved hands hovering uselessly, eyes flicking from the infant's blue-tinged skin to the clock ticking down the final seconds of protocol. And in that moment, I remember thinking how strange it was that a room so full of expertise could feel so completely powerless. How all the degrees on the walls and years in operating theaters meant nothing when a heart simply decided it was done. The baby had been born less than 6 hours earlier after a traumatic emergency C-section, alarms screaming as doctors worked to save both mother and child. And for a while it seemed like the worst had passed, breathing stabilized, vitals fragile but present, until without warning the monitors spiraled into chaos and then silence. A sudden collapse that none of the specialists could explain fast enough to stop. I stood against the wall near the doorway, a hospital administrator by title but a witness by circumstance, watching as the lead neonatologist called time in a voice that cracked just enough to reveal she wasn't immune to this kind of loss, no matter how many times she'd seen it. Outside the glass, the mother had sunk to the floor, sobbing into her own hospital gown, her hands still shaking from anesthesia, while a nurse knelt beside her whispering words that sounded hollow even from where I stood. And then there was the man at the end of the hallway, the one security had been trying unsuccessfully to keep calm since he arrived, the one who didn't fit into this sterile tragedy at all. He was tall, broad, leather vest creaking as he moved, tattoos visible even under the harsh fluorescent lights, his presence drawing glances from staff who had learned to assess risk in half seconds. And stitched across his back in unmistakable lettering was the Hell's Angels patch, wings spread wide like a warning. I remember thinking it was cruel irony that a man who looked like he belonged to violence had arrived just in time to witness the quietest kind of death. Security murmured into radios, debating whether to remove him, but he wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening anyone. He just stood there staring through the glass at the tiny, unmoving body, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Someone whispered that he was family, that he'd been listed as the emergency contact, and that detail alone was enough to shift the air in the room, because suddenly the story had layers we hadn't anticipated. When the doctors began disconnecting lines and silencing alarms, when the ritual motions of acceptance began, the biker took one step forward, then another, boots echoing softly on the polished floor, and I saw something in his face then that unsettled me more than anger ever could. A raw, desperate focus, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff replaying every regret he'd ever buried. He asked one simple question, his voice low and steady despite the chaos it cut through. "Are you done?" The lead surgeon turned, clearly bracing herself, and told him yes, that they'd exhausted every option medicine could offer, that sometimes there were no answers, only limits. And as she spoke, I watched his jaw tighten, not in defiance, but in grief, the kind that comes from recognizing a moment you can never redo. He moved closer to the glass, lifted a hand as if to touch it, then stopped himself, swallowing hard, and said something so quiet I almost missed it. "My kid died like this." The room stilled, the words landing heavier than any accusation, and he went on, explaining in fragments that years ago, before the club, before the prison time, before the road became his refuge, he lost a daughter in a hospital room that looked exactly like this one, machines humming, professionals shaking their heads, and no one letting him near her, because protocol said grief made people unpredictable. He wasn't asking to fight, he said. He wasn't asking for miracles. He was asking to try something they hadn't, because what they had left was already nothing. I saw the doctors exchange glances, saw the ethical debate flicker behind their eyes, and I knew the rulebook didn't have a chapter for this kind of request, especially not from a man society had taught them to fear. The clock on the wall ticked past the official time of death, the kind of detail that later becomes important in reports and lawsuits, and still no one moved to stop him as he washed his hands at the sink, slow and deliberate. following the nurse's instructions with a reverence that surprised everyone watching. When he finally stepped into the room, the contrast was almost surreal. Leather and ink beside incubators and 4 poles. A man forged by roads and violence standing in a space dedicated to fragile beginnings. And as he placed his bare hands on the infant's chest, I felt the tension coil through every person present. A collective breath held not because we believed, but because we were afraid to hope. He didn't pray out loud, didn't speak to anyone else. He leaned close and began to hum, low and steady, a sound so soft it barely registered above the machines. And I remember thinking how absurd it was, how unscientific, how pointless. And yet no one interrupted him, because when you've already lost, rules feel like suggestions. That was the moment part 1 truly began, not with sirens or shouting, but with a man the world had written off doing the only thing he knew how to do when everything else had failed. The humming continued, low and steady, vibrating through the silence like a pulse borrowed from somewhere deeper than medicine. And I watched the doctors hover in a strange limbo between intervention and disbelief, their training screaming at them to step in while something older, quieter told them to wait, because whatever was happening no longer belonged to charts or protocols. The biker, Caleb, I later learned, kept his hands warm against the infant's chest, his eyes closed as if shutting out the room entirely. And for several long seconds nothing changed, the monitors still dark, the air still heavy with finality, until a nurse near the back inhaled sharply and whispered, "Did anyone touch the leads?" Because the screen had flickered, just once, a brief stutter of green light that shouldn't have been there. The neonatologist stepped closer, checking connections, her movements suddenly precise but urgent. And then it happened again. Another faint blip, weak but undeniable, and the room shifted instantly from mourning to motion, as if someone had flipped a switch we didn't know existed. Heart rate registering, someone said, disbelief cracking their voice, and Caleb didn't stop humming, didn't look up, just stayed exactly where he was, like he was afraid that even a breath out of rhythm might undo whatever fragile thread had been pulled back into place. Oxygen saturation numbers crawled upward, 1 agonizing digit at a time, the baby's chest lifting almost imperceptibly beneath his hands, and I felt the kind of awe that makes your skin prickle, the realization that you're witnessing something that will never fully make sense no matter how many times it's replayed later. The doctors moved fast then, but not in the way they had before. This wasn't defeat-driven urgency. This was careful, reverent coordination, as if they were afraid to scare the moment away. And when the infant let out a thin, furious cry, it cut through the room like a lightning strike, raw and alive and impossible to ignore. A nurse covered her mouth. The surgeon closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself. And the mother outside the glass looked up as if pulled by instinct alone, her face registering hope before her brain could catch up and tell her it was dangerous to believe again. Caleb finally stopped humming then, his shoulders sagging as if the sound had been holding him upright, and tears streamed down his face unchecked as he stepped back, giving the medical team space without being asked, like he understood suddenly that his part was done. They stabilized the infant quickly. Intubation, warming, fluids, medications reintroduced with a precision that bordered on frantic, and within minutes the baby was alive in a way that could be measured, recorded, defended. When the room finally exhaled, when the crisis settled into controlled chaos, the lead neonatologist turned to Caleb and did something I'd never seen a doctor do in my years at that hospital. She thanked him, not as a courtesy, not as a platitude, but as one professional acknowledging another kind of knowledge she didn't possess. Later, after reports were filed and the mother was reunited with her child, after the explanations turned clinical and cautious, spontaneous recovery, unexplained response, rare autonomic reset, I found Caleb sitting alone in the waiting area, leather vest folded neatly beside him like armor set down, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I sat across from him, unsure why, and he told me quietly that when his daughter died, no one let him touch her, no one let him say goodbye properly, and he'd carried that failure like a sentence ever since, riding further and harder every year trying to outrun it. I didn't save her, he said, voice flat but eyes wet. But maybe I paid something forward. When he finally stood to leave, security didn't stop him this time. Nurses nodded as he passed, and the mother hugged him without hesitation, her gratitude fierce and unfiltered, the kind that ignores appearances completely. The chart would never credit him. The textbooks would never mention what happened in that room. But everyone who stood there that night would remember the moment medicine reached its limit and something human stepped in. In the days that followed, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm. Codes announced over intercoms, gurneys rolling down hallways, grief and relief passing each other like strangers. But something subtle had changed, at least for those of us who had been there that night. Because once you witness the impossible up close, the ordinary never quite fits the same again. The infant remained in the NICU for observation, fragile but stable, her heart steady enough now to lull even the most cautious specialists into guarded optimism. And while the official reports remained careful with their language, the staff spoke in quieter tones when her name came up, as if acknowledging that something beyond training had brushed past them and left fingerprints they couldn't chart. The mother visited constantly, sitting for hours beside the incubator, whispering promises and gratitude into the tiny space, and more than once I saw her glance toward the hallway, as if expecting Caleb to reappear, though he never did. He didn't come back for recognition or closure. He rode out before dawn the next morning, the night's events already folding themselves into the long road of his life. But he left something behind nonetheless, a shift in perspective that lingered like an afterimage. The neonatologist later admitted to me, over coffee gone cold, that she'd replayed the moment endlessly in her head, not searching for fault, but for understanding, wondering how often medicine dismisses the power of presence because it can't be quantified, how many times protocol builds walls where connection might matter just as much. Weeks later, the baby was discharged, her case quietly discussed at grand rounds under the heading of unexplained recovery. And while theories were offered, vagal stimulation, delayed neurological response, coincidence stacked on coincidence, none fully satisfied the people who'd watched a heartbeat return under a stranger's hands. I found myself thinking about Caleb more than I expected, about how easily we categorize people into threats or liabilities, how quickly we decide who belongs in places of care and who doesn't, and how wrong those instincts can be when life refuses to follow our assumptions. One afternoon, long after the headlines that never came in the paperwork that did, a small package arrived at the hospital addressed simply to the NICU staff. Inside was a handwritten note and a worn but meticulously cleaned leather bracelet, the kind bikers trade as symbols of debt or respect, and the note read, "You let me do something I wasn't allowed to do once. Thank you for trusting me with what mattered most." No signature, no patch, just that. The bracelet now sits tucked away in a drawer in the unit, not displayed, not explained, but occasionally touched by someone who needs reminding that not all healing wears scrubs or speaks in diagnostics. I still walk past that glass wall sometimes and picture the room as it was, the flat line, the silence, the man no one wanted there until they needed him. And I think about how close we came to ending the story too soon because it didn't fit the rules. The baby will grow up never knowing the details, never needing to, and that's as it should be. But for the rest of us, the memory remains as a quiet challenge, to look again at the people we dismiss, to recognize that compassion doesn't always arrive in acceptable forms, and to remember that sometimes the difference between an ending and a beginning is the courage to let someone try when there's nothing left to lose.